Yeah, so I will be talking about animal agriculture's impact on climate change and other planetary boundaries. And I will also briefly be touching the subject of food security, because our agricultural system at the moment is very much endangering food security all over the planet. And yeah, let's get right to it. This is basically the core reason why using animals in agriculture is very unsustainable. And it's about energy conversion between trophic levels. Sounds complicated. It's actually quite simple. What is a trophic level? It's a hierarchical level in an ecosystem, and it shows the position of an organism in a food web. So when we look at the bottom here, we see producers being plants, and they store chemical energy from the sun and provide it to primary consumers, which are mostly animals used in agriculture and ideally us humans. And when we move to the second level, so the secondary consumers, so when we eat animals, we are accepting energy losses in the range of 90%. So this is a rule of thumb. It's a principle in nature, which we can never bypass. And this energy is being lost through basically the metabolism of the animals, the building of the skeleton. So yeah, 90% of it is being lost to the environment through respiration, digestion, and excretion. So what this means is when we want to have a lot of the 10% for the secondary consumers, we get much more of the 90%. So this being climate damaging gases, we need a lot of land, we need a lot of fertilizer, and on another level, we need a lot of subsidies to keep the system going, for example. And yeah, this is basically the core reason why animal agriculture is so destructive, so problematic, causing so many problems, and being incredibly wasteful as well. And a simple way of putting it is animals are just really highly inefficient bioreactors. Don't get me wrong, animals are wonderful, but on a physical level, they're just not very good at converting nutrients. And currently we're using 75 to 80 billion of these highly inefficient bioreactors, and that's causing a lot of damage. And one of the most shocking correlations where we see this is when we look at the use of our global agricultural land. This is from a landmark study from the Oxford University. Probably many of you have heard of it. And yeah, it's mind-blowing, really. We're using 83% of our agricultural land for animal products. And this, in turn, supplies us with 18% of global calories. And then if we look at it the other way, 17% of the land we're using for agriculture supplies us with more than 80% of global calories. And this is just absolutely mind-boggling. And it leads to incredible injustices like we're seeing right now in Eastern Africa. Our motto tonight is starving around the Christmas tree. And yeah, people are starving there. These are just very recent headlines. And yeah, when we look at my country, for example, Germany, we feed 2/3 of our grain harvest. We use it to feed it to animals. And also when we look at the grain ships that just recently were able to leave Ukrainian harbors again, they didn't go to the Horn of Africa where people are starving. They went to Spain, France, and Germany to supply the animal industry with cheap animal feed. And yeah, so this is a crime against humanity of epic proportions. And I'm not even talking about the animals here. And obviously, it's also There's a strong linkage to climate change because in East Africa, we are seeing a very, very bad drought. And so let's have a look at what the Oxford study is saying about climate change and animal agriculture's contribution to it. So this is, in my opinion, probably the most reasonable number out there at the moment. They come to the conclusion that a plant-based food system would save 28% of global emissions. And there's basically 4 positions here. We have direct CO2 emissions from forest fire clearings, so when forests are being burned down, and then obviously also the direct fossil fuels emissions for fertilizer production and transportation and so on. Then we have direct nitrous oxide emissions. It's a very, very potent greenhouse gas that is being created by the decomposition of manure and chemical fertilizer. Then we have carbon opportunity costs, very important. So when we're using the land that we could grow forests on, for example, instead for farming animals, it's we're missing out big time. And then we have methane emissions, and yeah, Peter already touched on the subject, explained it very well. I'm gonna touch on it on the next slide because it's really, really important. And then another interesting aspect and also shocking aspect is the fishing industry. What about fishing? Just last year, a study from the famous magazine Nature found out that just one fishing method, bottom trawling, incredibly destructive, and so it means stirring up the seafloor in a big way, and it causes as much carbon emissions as total global aviation. Really, really crazy. And that's not even in these studies, so there's still a lot of science that needs to be done on this. Yeah, and then about methane, the climate emergency is really a methane emergency. And this graphic might be a bit overwhelming, but I really just want you to focus on the 2 orange bars on the top. And so what this shows is a change in global surface temperature after a 1-year pulse in present day emissions. So the heating up of our global surface after we expose it to 1 year of current emissions. So what we're seeing here is that the response after 10 years because of methane is very, very large. And then when we look at it after 100 years, it's almost disappearing. And this is exactly what Peter already said. It's when we're using the global warming potential of methane over 100 years, we're really not considering the full damage potential of methane. As it's decomposing after about 11 to 12 years, it does a lot of, it's very, very potent in its first phase. And then if we're using a time horizon of 100 years, we're watering down the effect very much. So 100 years, the global warming potential of methane is about 30. Then if we look at a time horizon of 20, it's already up to 80. And then if we look at the instantaneous global warming potential, so in every single given moment, the ability of a methane molecule to trap heat in the atmosphere, it's up to 150. So this is really, really important. And the animal industry and the oil industry, they really want us to use this time horizon of 100 years because that's really, it's watering down the destructive effects of this molecule. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. And a famous IPCC scientist, lead reviewer, he says cutting methane is our best and probably last hope to keep the planet safe. So it's a very, very important lever. If we want to have direct cooling effects, we have to decrease methane emissions as fast as possible. Okay, and then generally, when we're talking about animal agriculture, it's really important to not only focus on climate change and climate damaging emissions. It's very important to also focus on other planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries is a concept introduced by the Stockholm Center for Resilience, and they represent 9 different processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. And animal agriculture is impacting 4 of them in a major way. So we see that climate change, biodiversity, land use change, and biogeochemical flows are already exceeded very strongly, and novel entities, which are like plastic pollution, heavy metals, and so on. But let's focus on the other 4. And climate change and biodiversity, they are planetary boundaries that can single-handedly make our planet uninhabitable, and they are reinforcing each other. And then land use change is a really, really important metric when we want to look at general environmental destruction. 3/4 of land use change currently are happening because of animal agriculture. And then also a very strongly exceeded boundary is the biogeochemical flows, more commonly known as nitrogen and phosphorus emissions. And this is also mainly impacted by animal agriculture. And they are really poisoning our groundwater, destroying waterways, and causing massive ocean dead zones. Okay, and so lastly, I want to present to you the Animal and Climate Save's environmental campaign. It's called the Plant-Based Treaty. It's a roadmap towards a plant-based food system and a roadmap for exiting animal production, really. And yeah, so the 3 principles are relinquish, stop the problem from increasing, getting worse. So no more land use change, including deforestation for animal agriculture, no more factory farms, and redirect, eliminate the driving forces behind the problem. So this is really about stopping the incredibly damaging subsidies that are going into animal agriculture, and promote plant-based foods and actively transition away from our current food system. And then, very importantly, 3rd principle is restore, actively rewild nature. As you saw, because we use so much land for animal agriculture, there's huge potential in rewilding, drawing down carbon, and stopping the methane emergency, and also stopping the collapse of biodiversity.